Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've always felt that a musician has a different relationship with silence. For most people, silence is the absence of sound. For me, a cellist, silence is the blank canvas on which music will be born. It's a sacred space. After my wife and I separated, I moved into an old brick building in Chicago looking for just that, a space to fill with my own music, not the memories of a life together. The apartment was on the third floor and had what realtors call character, a euphemism for old and with unpredictable acoustics. For the first few days, it was perfect. The sound of my cello filled the space, the notes of Bach echoing off the hardwood floors. The first time I noticed it, it was subtle. I was practicing a particularly difficult passage from Suite Number 1. I missed a note, stopped, took a deep breath, and in the silence that followed, I heard a muffled sound coming from the floor. It was the same passage with the same mistake, played faintly like a distant echo. I thought it was my imagination, the building settling, or perhaps a strange echo the old structure was producing. But it happened again. The next day, I was playing Vivaldi. As I finished a movement, the ghost version started up downstairs, a few seconds behind. It was a carbon copy, note for note. My first reaction was irritation. Was it another musician trying to practice along with me? It was a bizarre coincidence, but still within the realm of possibility. The problem was that the echo wasn't limited to music. One night, I got up to get a drink of water and tripped over a book, which fell to the floor with a dull thud. 3 seconds later, the same thud came from below. My heart raced. I tested it. I clapped my hands 3 times. Clap, 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 dot, silence. And then pum, pum, pum. The muffled sound, the same cadence coming from the ground. This wasn't an echo. It was an imitation. There was someone in the apartment below listening to every sound I made and playing it back. The sense of violation was immediate and absolute. My sanctuary of silence had become a resonance chamber, and I was the tuning fork. The days that followed were an exercise in paranoia. My every step, my every cough, my every object I moved was followed by its phantom replica. I began to walk on tiptoe, holding my breath. The silence I had been seeking so much was now my only weapon. If I didn't make a sound, my mysterious neighbor wouldn't either. We lived in a shared, tense silence for almost a week. I've always been struck by a quote from that Danish philosopher. What's his name? Oh, do we go crazy alone? Or do we need an echo to confirm our own existence? And what is scarier? A neighbor who imitates you, or discovering that in the silence, you have become an echo of yourself? I don't know the answer. I only know that sometimes when a house is too quiet, I swear I hear the sound of someone breathing exactly in time with me. And I pray that it is me. Stand in tombs. That night, I woke up to a noise, slow, shuffling, a rustling of straw on the asphalt. I went to the window, my heart in my throat. There was nothing there. The street was empty and silent under the pale light of a street lamp. It was a dream, I told myself. I remembered when I was a child and my grandmother taught me a prayer to ward off fear. What did it go by? Guardian angel, my sweet companion. The rest was lost in memory. The next morning, when I went in my car, there was something on the hood. A small doll, no bigger than my hand, made of twigs and straw. A miniature wicker man. It wasn't a gift. It was a warning. That was enough. I packed my things and decided I would return with backup, with a court order, with whatever it took. As I loaded my suitcase into the car, the sun barely rising, I saw movement near Lucas's house. It was the boy. He was standing in front of his family's straw man. He wasn't looking at the doll. He reached out with his tiny hand and adjusted the scarecrow's arm, turning the straw hand so it was pointing a little more to the left, like a child adjusting the collar of his father's coat. But then the boy turned and looked directly at me across the street. His eyes were not those of a frightened child. They were cold, knowing. And at the same moment, the wicker man, the figure of burlap and rags, turned his faceless head toward me. It was not a quick movement. It was not the wind. It was slow, deliberate, and impossible. I didn't wait any longer. I got in my car and sped off, kicking up dust on the dirt road. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I closed the case. In my report, I wrote that the complaint was unfounded. I lied to protect myself. I abandoned Lucas to that system. To this day, the thought of what happened eats away at me. My mission was to protect the child, but protect her from what? From a frightened mother? Or from an entire town that has made a pact with something that dresses in old clothes and waits in the gardens? That final scene haunts me with a terrible ethical question. To what extent do we have the right to call something evil just because we don't understand it? What if, in trying to save the victim, we are actually desecrating the only guardian she knows? I've always loved silence more than most people. Not the silence of a graveyard, but the living, textured silence. As a documentary soundman, I spent 15 years of my life obsessed with capturing the breath of a forest or the hum of a sleeping town. When burnout hit, I dropped everything and rented a cheap house in Harmony Creek, Nebraska. The name was a ready-made joke, but the promise of isolation was real. It was one of those small American towns where everyone knows everyone else and nothing ever happens. Perfect. The house was old, made of wood, with the kind of creaking noise that tells a story. For the first few days, I devoted myself to a personal ritual, mapping the acoustics of the place. I placed my high-sensitivity microphones in each room, not as a job, but out of habit. I wanted to know the sounds of my new life. The creak of the wood contracting in the night, the whistle of the wind in the window frame, the low hum of the old refrigerator. It was a symphony of peace. At least, at first, it all started in the second week. It was a low, barely perceptible humming noise that would always appear around 3 a.m. At first, I rationalized it. Was it the electrical wiring? A distant water pipe? I spent an entire day checking every possible source. I turned off the main circuit breaker, turned off the water supply, and at 3 a.m., there it was, a constant humming noise at a frequency that made my teeth chatter slightly. It was annoying, but more than that, it was illogical. One night, I decided to record it. I set up my professional equipment, the same one I used to capture the sound of larvae eating inside a tree in the Amazon. If there was a sound there, I would capture it in its purest form. I left it recording and went to sleep. The next morning, I made some coffee and put on my headphones. The hum was there, crystal clear in the audio. But there was something else. Beneath that monotonous frequency, almost hidden, I heard a whisper. It sounded like a count. 7, 4, 1, 9. The numbers were in no order. My heart froze. I checked the cables, the microphones, the software. No interference, no other audio source. It was impossible. That night, paranoia began to set in. The silence of the house was no longer comforting. It was a stage waiting for the next sound. Every creak made me jump. I tried to remember some detail from the home inspection. Someone the realtor had mentioned, a previous resident? His name was, what was it? Something like Johnson. Or was it Jones? The memory gap irritated me. It didn't matter. I followed the thought of filmmaker David Lynch. Fear guards the door to the unknown. I felt like I had my hand on the doorknob, and the door was starting to shake. I called the police. What else was I supposed to do? A young police officer who looked like he would rather be anywhere else came to the house. I explained the situation, showed him my equipment, and told him about the noise and the whispering. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He stayed for an hour, walked around the house, heard nothing out of the ordinary, and left, suggesting that perhaps I should have my wiring checked by a professional. The isolation I had been seeking was now a gun pointed at me. I was alone with this. From that night on, the phenomenon escalated. The whispering and the recordings became clearer. They were no longer just numbers. They were sentences, fragmented, disjointed, under the floorboards. No one will find. Always watching. I spent hours listening to the audios, trying to decipher the message, feeling a chill that did not come from the Nebraska cold. I began to doubt my own sanity. I remembered my grandfather, a man who spent his entire life fixing old radios. He used to say that some radios, even when turned off, could still pick up echoes of the past, like ghosts trapped in the circuitry. He called it the memory of the air. At the time, I had thought it was poetic. Now, it seemed like a diagnosis. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday. I was exhausted, having not slept properly in days. I decided to make one last recording. I set up the microphones in the basement, the one place I hadn't explored in depth yet. The air was humid and smelled of wet earth and oblivion. I left the recorder on and went upstairs, locking the door as if that would contain whatever was down there. At 3 a.m., the usual buzzing began, but this time it was louder, coming straight from downstairs. This time, I didn't need my headphones to hear the whisper. It came up through the cracks in the floorboards, and for the first time, the voice was perfectly clear. It wasn't a stranger, it was my voice, and it said, quietly over and over again, I should never have come here. At that moment, the terror stopped being a suspicion and became a physical presence in the room with me. It wasn't about a strange sound. It was about me. How was that possible? I wasn't speaking. My mouth was closed, the air trapped in my lungs. I dropped everything. I grabbed my car keys, my wallet, and my phone and ran outside into the cold rain. I didn't look back. As I drove aimlessly away from Harmony Creek, the silence inside the car was deafening. The humming had stopped. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that house. Was it a haunting? A bizarre acoustic trap of the house? Or was it the sound of my own mental exhaustion manifesting itself in a form that my audio-trained mind could understand. The final reflection always leads me to the same disturbing question. Does every place have a voice, and only some of us are tuned in to hear it? And if you hear something terrible, is it the place's fault for speaking, or yours for listening? Maybe the mistake, as my grandfather would say, was simply being silent for too long. I've always thought that back roads were more interesting than major highways. They have character, telling the story of a place with their twists and turns. As a surveyor, my job is to translate that story into the cold, precise language of maps. I define boundaries. I bring order to the chaos of geography. I was hired by the city of Sallow Creek, West Virginia, to do the first complete topographical resurvey of the county in almost 80 years. It was a tedious job for most, but for me, it was a fascinating puzzle. Sallow Creek is the kind of place that time forgot and maps prefer to ignore. Nestled in a deep Appalachian valley, the town seemed to exist in a permanent sepia tone. The people were few and far between, the kind who watch you from behind curtains. My contact at City Hall, an elderly man named Miller, handed me a stack of old maps, their edges yellowed and worn. "Good luck," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This country has its own mind." At first, the work was exactly as I had expected. Technical challenges, difficult terrain, but nothing out of the ordinary. I set up my total station, a state-of-the-art theodolite, and began measuring the boundaries, comparing the GPS data with the stone and iron markers described in the old documents. The first anomaly appeared on the third day. A stream labeled Whisper Wind Creek on the map was a good 50 meters from where it should have been. I rationalized. Erosion, an ancient weather event. The original map was inaccurate, normal. The strangeness deepened as I began mapping the northern boundary, an area of dense, untouched forest. The old map showed a hunting trail that connected two hills. I spent a whole day searching for it. There was no trace. It was as if the trail had been erased from the earth itself. Once again, I tried to explain 80 years is a long time. The forest is reclaiming what is its own. But a nagging feeling began to form in the back of my mind. That feeling that something was fundamentally out of place. The break in logic came on Friday. I had spent the morning marking a property line with wooden stakes painted fluorescent orange. It was meticulous work, accurate to the nearest centimeter. After lunch, I went back to collect a final reference point. One of my stakes, the one that marked the southeast corner of a plot of land, was not where I had left it. It had moved 6 feet to the east. I looked around, my heart pounding. The ground around it was untouched. No footprints, no sign that it had been ripped up and replaced. It was just wrong. My first thought was that it was the locals trying to scare me, but the stillness of the forest seemed to mock that idea. I remembered my father, also a surveyor, and a tool he loved. What was its name? Yes, a planimeter. He always said, "Trust your instruments, Clara. They don't lie." But what if the very ground beneath the instruments was the lie? Over the next week, work became a psychological nightmare. Instruments began to fail in subtle, inexplicable ways. The GPS signal would waver and get lost in the deepest valleys, which was to be expected, but sometimes out in the open, under clear skies, it would simply go dark. I would see things in the periphery of my vision. the outline of a cabin where there was nothing, the shadow of a fence in an empty field. I was becoming an unreliable narrator of my own reality. I follow the line of science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. Reality is the thing that, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. The problem with Sallow Creek was that things would disappear the moment I tried to confirm them. The place operated under its own physics, a perverse geometry that seemed to constantly rewrite itself. The climax came when I tried to find the original landmark of the town's founding, described in an 1890 deed as an iron post at the base of an old oak, where the shadow of noon does not touch. The coordinates were useless. I had to follow the description, using only a compass and old notes. I entered a part of the forest so silent that my own footsteps sounded like a desecration, and then I saw it, a huge oak, gnarled with age, and at its base, covered in moss, a rusty iron post. I knelt down, relief washing over me. I took a picture, prepared my equipment to record the spot. Then a cold breeze swept across the clearing, and I felt it, a presence, not of a person, but of the place itself, an ancient, indifferent watchfulness. I scraped the moss off the iron post, looking for some inscription. There was, but it wasn't a date or the founder's initials. It was a single word, freshly scratched into the metal, shining through the rust. Skirt! Panic hit me like a physical blow. I jumped to my feet and looked around. The forest was not the same as the one I had come through. The trees seemed closer together, their shapes more crooked. The sunlight barely penetrated their canopies. I was lost. Completely, irretrievably lost. I ran. No direction, no thought, just the primal instinct to flee. I tripped over roots. Branches scratched my face, but I didn't stop until I collapsed on a paved road miles from where my truck was. I abandoned everything. The surveying equipment, worth tens of thousands of dollars, was left behind. I drove out of Sallow Creek and never looked back. I emailed the city, withdrawing from the job, citing unresolvable terrain discrepancies and lack of local cooperation. I never received a response. Sometimes at night, I open a map and look at the blank space where Sallow Creek should be. I think about that iron post. Who wrote that word? A local? Or was it a warning from the place itself? This brings me to a final reflection on my own craft. Is our desire to measure and map everything a form of arrogance, an attempt to impose human logic on places that were never intended to be understood? And what happens when one of those places, tired of being measured, starts measuring you back? People romanticize solitude. They talk about it as a spiritual retreat, a reconnection with yourself. Nonsense. Solitude has teeth, and if you sit still long enough, it starts to chew you up. I know this because I sought it out. My name is Alex, and after a decade as a park ranger dealing with lost tourists and preventable tragedies, I traded it all for the promise of silence in a fire lookout tower on Redstone Peak, Montana. 6 months of staring out at a sea of trees with a radio as my only companion. To me, it sounded like paradise. The guard who led me to the base of the tower, a gray-haired man named Henderson, was oddly quiet. "Frank left in a hurry," he said as he unloaded my supplies. "He didn't even wait for his replacement. He left some stuff behind." He didn't look me in the eye when he said this. Frank was my predecessor. The tower was exactly as I had imagined it. A glass and metal cabin perched 100 feet in the air, an eagle's nest on top of the world. The view was spectacular and oppressive. For the first few days, I settled into the routine, waking up, scanning the horizon with binoculars, recording the weather, reading, listening to the radio crackling with the chatter of other distant lookouts. It was monastic peace. But then I began to notice the things Frank had left behind. There was a bird book with all the pages about crows ripped out. On the windowsill were small etchings, as if he were counting the days, and the official logbook. Frank's last weeks were unsettling. The weather notes gave way to loose sentences. He's looking again. The valley has eyes. The radio lies. The first time the aggression showed itself, it was subtle. One night, around 2 a.m, my radio crackled. It wasn't a call from another tower, it was static, and beneath it, a distorted childish melody like a broken music box playing underwater. It lasted for maybe 20 seconds and then stopped. In the morning, I reported it. The response from the other end was bureaucratic and dismissive. Probably atmospheric interference, Redstone. Keep the channel clear. They isolated me even further, branded me an impressionable newbie. But things got worse. A week later, I woke up and, while making my morning rounds on the walkway that surrounded the cabin, found a dead crow. Its body was perfectly intact, except for its neck, which was broken at an unnatural angle. There were no marks, no blood, no footprint other than my own. It had simply been placed there, an offering, a warning. The solitude I had sought so long began to feel like a trap. That silence I had loved now had a weight, an expectation, and the constant nagging feeling that I was being watched from somewhere in that green expanse. I followed the thought of Joseph Conrad, who wrote in Heart of Darkness, "The face of absolute evil is nothing but emptiness, utter darkness." I was living in a glass box in the middle of an ocean of darkness, and I felt, with a terrifying certainty, that something in that void was looking back at me. Paranoia became my constant companion. I spent hours with the binoculars, looking not for smoke, but for movement, a glint of metal, a color that didn't belong in the forest. The stress began to unearth things I'd rather keep buried. The image of a little girl's face, a hiker I'd failed to rescue in time at my old job. The name of the search protocol we used, it was a unified response system? No, it was Incident Command System. The memory lapse made me dizzy. Guilt was a poison I'd come here to purge, but the isolation only seemed to concentrate it. The assault became direct, personal. On a moonless night, the radio came to life again. This time, there was no music, just harsh breathing, and then a whisper that pierced the static and embedded itself in my brain. Ilex, just my name, spoken with a hateful familiarity. I turned off the receiver with shaking hands, but the sound kept echoing in the cabin, in my head. I didn't report it. How could I? What would I say? That the radio knew my name? The end came with the storm. It came from the west, a black wall of cloud that swallowed the sky. The wind whipped at the tower, making the metal groan. The radio died, replaced by a hollow hum. I was completely alone and blind, and then I saw it. In a flash of lightning far below, at the edge of the tree line, a figure, tall, thin, still, just standing in the pouring rain, staring up, staring at me. Terror paralyzed me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then I heard it, a sound that wasn't the storm, a bum, metallic, rhythmic, coming from below, bum, Closer. It was someone or something climbing the metal stairs, in the rain, in the wind, one step at a time, heavy, relentless, hum. He was in no hurry. Boom. The sound rose, echoing through the structure, through my rib cage. I was trapped in the sky. I grabbed the fire axe from the wall, the only weapon I had. I backed into the corner farthest from the door, the wood heavy in my sweaty hand. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the noise. He was out there, on the other side of the door, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that. All night, I think. Huddled together, waiting for the door to shatter. But nothing happened. When the first gray rays of sunlight broke through the storm, I plucked up my courage and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door. The walkway was empty, wet with rain. But on the door, scratched deep into the wood, were 2 words. Your turn. Over the radio, which had come back on with the sun, I declared a medical emergency. I made up chest pains, difficulty breathing. Within hours, the sound of a helicopter cut through the air. As they hoisted me to safety, I looked down at my tower, my prison. And I swear, for an instant, I saw a figure move inside the glass cabin. Now, I am back in the city, surrounded by noise and people, but I have never felt so alone. The question that destroys me is not whether what I saw was real. The question is deeper, more terrible. When we seek isolation to escape the world, what do we do when the world follows us there? And which is the greater threat? A monster that climbs your stairs in the darkness, or the part of you that has been silently waiting for it? I've always been fascinated by the beauty of decay. As a photographer, I've spent years capturing the skeletons of places America has forgotten. But there's a difference between the melancholy beauty of an abandoned theater and the brutal menace of a dead steel mill. I knew that. Liam, of course, didn't care. To him, danger was the spice. That's why we were here at dusk, cutting a fence outside Bethlehem Iron in Pennsylvania. Me, Liam, and Chloe. Think of the textures, Marco, Liam whispered, the pliers squeaking, the rust, the twisted metal. It's pure gold. Chloe, the historian of our trio, was most interested in the buildings. This plant was the heart of the city for a century. It died in the 1990s. It's an industrial graveyard. I didn't say anything. I just felt the cold air and the smell of metal and old oil enter my lungs. I remembered the car accident I'd been in college, the sound of metal squeaking around me. Ever since then, the squeak of old metal has sent a shiver down my spine. But I stood there, ignoring my instincts out of loyalty or stupidity. The complex was a maze of sleeping giants. Rusting blast furnaces rose like unholy cathedrals against the purple sky. The silence was heavy, almost liquid. At first, it was a photographer's paradise. But then we began to see the anomalies. Fresh footprints in the decades-old dust. A fire in an oil drum, the ashes still warm, and strange symbols painted in thick black paint, spirals with a dot in the center. This was no ordinary graffiti. This was territorial. Someone's living here, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Beggars, probably, Liam replied, already stepping forward. They won't bother us. The real break in logic came when we found one of the main warehouses. The sliding steel door was locked with a new heavy padlock. It was a glaring contradiction in the midst of so much ruin. Liam smiled, pulling a tool from his backpack. Within minutes, the padlock gave way. The interior was pitch black. We turned on our flashlights. The beam of light didn't reveal an empty factory floor. It revealed a campsite. Several dirty mattresses on the floor, boxes of food, and in the center, a grotesque altar made of engine parts, rebar, and animal bones, bound together with wire. A shiver ran down my spine. This was no shelter. It was a nest, a den. "We have to get out of here," Chloe whispered, her academic curiosity finally giving way to primal fear. "Now," I agreed. But before we could move, we heard it. The sound of a truck engine approaching, fast. The beams of its headlights swept across the warehouse facade. We turned off our flashlights and plunged into the darkness, our hearts hammering against our ribs. They were back, and we had broken down their door. The warehouse door opened with a loud bang that echoed through the cavernous space. 3 men entered. They were large, dressed in worn work clothes, and they moved with a quiet, predatory familiarity. One of them shone his flashlight on the broken padlock on the floor. There was no shouting, no fuss. He simply turned to the others and nodded. The hunt was on. We split up. A stupid horror movie mistake. But at the time, it seemed like the only option. Liam went one way, Chloe and I the other, slipping past colossal machines that looked like sleeping beasts. The game had changed. We were no longer explorers. We were prey. Their aggression was palpable in the silence. In the methodical way they began to sweep the place with their flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness like blades. Hiding behind a boiler, the smell of rust choking me, my mind betrayed me. I flashed back to the crash. The sound of metal, the smell of gasoline, the calm voice of the paramedic who pulled me from the wreckage. What was his name? Damn. There was a sticker on his helmet. A fish. Mike? Yeah, I think it was Mike. That feeling of being trapped, helpless, was the same. But here, there were no sirens coming. I follow the thought of the writer William Golding. Man produces evil as the bee produces honey. Those men were not supernatural monsters. They were worse. They were humans who had shed any veneer of civilization, and we were an insect that had invaded their hive. I heard a scream, high-pitched, terrified. It was Chloe's voice. It came from the other side of the warehouse. One of the beams of light locked onto a spot, and then I heard a scuffle, a thud, and then silence. They had her. My blood ran cold in my veins. The assault was no longer a threat. It was a fact. Panic seized me, and I ran clumsy and blind. I turned a narrow hallway between 2 hydraulic presses and ran face to face with one of them. He was huge, bearded, and his eyes were expressionless. He didn't scream. He just lifted a crowbar he was holding in his hand. Without thinking, I grabbed a piece of rebar from the ground and brought it down with all my strength on his knee. He roared, a guttural sound of pain and surprise, and fell. I didn't wait to see more. I ran, the sound of his heavy breathing and curses echoing behind me. The violence of the act, the feel of metal against bone, made me sick. I had crossed a line. I found Liam near a metal staircase that led to an upper level. He was white as a sheet. "They got Chloe," he gasped. "I know," I replied, my voice hoarse. "We have to leave." "We can't leave her," he shouted, his adrenaline turning into angry panic. He grabbed me by the collar, his eyes wild. "Did you hear her?" I pushed him away hard. "There's nothing we can do, Liam. They'll kill us." The aggression I felt wasn't just for the hunters. It was for him, for his recklessness that had put us here. Our discussion was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Liam looked at me, his face contorted into a mask of hatred and fear. He made his decision. He ran, but not in the direction of the exit. He ran back into the darkness, toward where we had heard Chloe scream. I did the opposite. I ran in the direction I hoped would be the outer wall, the fence, freedom. I found a broken window and dove through, falling into a tangle of brush and metal. I ran to the barbed wire fence. Without hesitation, I climbed over it, the metal tearing at my jacket and skin. I ran through the woods until I found a road. I never looked back. I never saw Liam or Chloe again. To the police, I told a story about us getting lost, about the darkness and the separation. I didn't mention the men or the altar. How could I? They were ghosts, and I didn't want them to know my name. Sometimes at night, I think about that place, that nest of brutality thriving in the remains of our industry, and the thought that haunts me is this: how thick is the wall that separates us from that kind of savagery? When you are forced to fight, to hurt, to abandon someone in order to survive, can you ever really come back? Or does a part of you stay there forever in the rubble, with the taste of rust and fear in your mouth, discovering that you too know how to create evil? I always thought the smell of antiseptic was the smell of hope, a promise of cleanliness and order against the chaos of biology. In the big city emergency room where I worked, it was my armor. But here, in Blackwater Hollow, a dying town in the heart of Appalachia, the antiseptic felt like a thin layer over the smell of mildew and coal and resignation. My name is Sarah. I'm a head nurse, and I took a 6-month contract at this godforsaken clinic to escape my own ghosts. The irony, I realize now, is that some places don't have ghosts. They have worse. St. Jude's Clinic was a low, functional building serving a community of coal miners and their families, men and women of few words with coal dust etched into the lines of their hands and faces. The first week, I treated the routine cases, concussions, chronic respiratory problems, the routine of poverty. It was in the second week that the pattern began to emerge. They came with the same vague symptoms, a dry, persistent cough that didn't respond to any treatment, and their skin. Strange rashes, not like a common allergy, but forming almost geometric patterns, like veins of some strange mineral. The most disturbing part was their behavior, a profound apathy, a blank stare as if the life force was slowly being drained from them. When I asked about conditions in the mine, the town's only source of income, they clammed up. "It's just my job, nurse," was all they would say. The first crack in my professional reality came in the form of an old miner named Jedediah. He was in his bed, consumed by coughing. In a moment of apparent delirium, he gripped my arm with surprising strength. His eyes, previously empty, were filled with lucid terror. I expected a cry for help, a plea for morphine. Instead, he leaned in and whispered, his voice a gravel rattle. "She hears us breathing, deep down." Hours later, he died. Sudden respiratory arrest. The doctor on duty, Dr. Miller, a man as exhausted as the town, signed the death certificate. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the common miner's disease, but I knew it was a lie. It happened too quickly. As I prepared the body, I noticed that the rash on his chest had coalesced. It formed a perfect spiral over his heart, an impossible geometry. At that moment, the smell of antiseptic no longer seemed like a promise of hope. It seemed like the smell of a cover-up. The aggression didn't come with shouts or threats. It came with silence, a watchful, collective silence. More and more miners came to the clinic, their coughs and skin tags deepening. Their apathy began to morph into something more sinister. They watched me, sitting in the waiting room. Their eyes followed me in unison. Sometimes I would pass a group and hear rhythmic whispering, which would stop the moment I turned around. The clinic, my only refuge, became an aquarium where I was the only species different. I follow the thought of the writer Susan Sontag, who said that illness is the night side of life. In Blackwater Hollow, it seemed as if the night had swallowed the day and decided to live there forever. Stress began to unearth my own nights. The memory of the patient I lost in Chicago, the medication error I made out of exhaustion. I remembered the face of the head of the department. Dr. Evans? No, it was Egan. Dr. Egan. The look of disappointment on his face was almost as bad as the watchful silence of the miners. The terror became personal when one of them, a burly man named Silas, whose arms were covered in the strange spiraling rashes, cornered me in the supply room. He didn't touch me. He just stood in the doorway blocking the exit, his huge body filling the space. The aggression was in his calm, his certainty. "You ask too many questions, nurse," he said, his voice low and resonant. Then he started coughing. But it wasn't a normal cough. It was rhythmic, guttural, almost like a code. It felt like something inside him was using his lungs to form words. "You're not going anywhere," he said between coughs. "You breathe the same air we do, the dust. You're already part of the song." He raised his hand in the dim light of the lamp, and the marks on his skin seemed to darken and throb. In that instant, fear turned to pure adrenaline. I grabbed a steel instrument tray and threw it at his face with all my strength. He staggered back in surprise, and I ran outside, slamming the door and locking him inside. The sound of his rhythmic, now angry coughing echoed off the metal door. I didn't call the police. The sheriff was Silas's brother. I was alone. I ran to my dorm, threw my things into a suitcase, and grabbed my car keys. I had to leave. Now, as I walked out of the clinic, I saw Dr. Miller at the window of his office. He just stared at me, expressionless, and then slowly shook his head. It wasn't a gesture of disapproval. It was a gesture of pity. As I sped down the town's main street to escape, I saw the figures. On each balcony, a resident, standing still, motionless, watching me leave. They made no attempt to stop me. Their aggression was worse. It was the passive certainty of those who know that the cage is bigger than it seems. I'm miles away now, in an anonymous motel room, the smell of cigarettes and cheap disinfectant in the air. But I can't stop coughing. It's a dry cough scratching at my throat. I tug at the collar of my shirt in front of the bathroom mirror. On my collarbone, barely visible, is a small red mark, and it looks strangely geometric. The final reflection is a spiral that pulls me deeper. What did I bring with me from Blackwater Hollow? An unknown fungus? A toxin from the mine? Or something else? The question that keeps me from sleeping is not what I left behind. It is, where do I run when the enemy's map is drawn on my own skin? How do you escape a choir when you discover that your own breath is slowly learning the song? I've always thought bankruptcy had a specific smell, a mixture of dust, old paper, and stale air. It was the smell of the end, of dreams transformed into assets to be liquidated. My name is Jacob, and I'm a corporate gravedigger. My job is to travel to the corpses of failed companies, catalog their assets, and hammer the final nail into their financial coffins. It's a job that requires detachment and a firm belief in the cold logic of spreadsheets. It was this belief that led me to the New Mexico desert, to the abandoned campus of the Ethelred Institute. Officially, it was an executive wellness retreat that had gone spectacularly bankrupt. The place was a cluster of modernist and brutalist buildings baking under a merciless sun, a concrete scar in the middle of nowhere. The stillness was absolute, the kind of silence that strains your eardrums. I set to work, photographing, measuring, cataloging, but the Ethelred Institute was no spa. The relaxation suites contained chairs that looked like they had come from an interrogation lab. The flotation tanks were claustrophobic sensory deprivation chambers, and the accounting books were fiction, huge payments for geological surveys, sound dampening, and ultra-low frequency transmission equipment. None of it made sense. The main anomaly was in the central server room, a climate-controlled, soundproof vault, bizarrely still powered. It took me 2 days to get the access code from a terrified former employee. Inside, I found the digital files. Most of them were what I expected: corporate propaganda, guided meditations. But there was one folder, password protected, called The Tune. Inside were dozens of audio files. The first one I opened seemed to be pure silence. But my auditing software has audio analysis tools. Out of curiosity, I ran the file through a spectrum analyzer. The screen filled. It wasn't silence, it was sound. A complex sound wave at a frequency so low it was physically inaudible, designed to be felt, not heard. A sonic weapon disguised as meditation. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My spreadsheet logic couldn't explain it. For the first time in years, I was facing a swing I couldn't close. I didn't know it, but by touching that file, I had turned on something, a bell that only the devil could hear. The assault began subtly, internally, a constant nausea, throbbing headaches, and the feeling of paranoia, the certainty that every shadow in my peripheral field of vision was a moving figure. The silence of the desert was replaced by a phantom buzzing in my head. The first proof that I was not alone came on the third night. The power to my trailer, parked near the main building, suddenly went out. I stepped out into the cold, starry night. The generator was silent. I knelt down to inspect it and saw the problem. The fuel line was not broken. It had been cut cleanly and deliberately. Someone was there in the darkness watching me. The corporate grave digger had become the object of inventory. The pressure reminded me of my mentor, Arthur, a brilliant man who had taught me everything about the business. He had killed himself after liquidating a particularly sordid pension fund. He always used a specific pen to sign the final documents. Oh, what was the brand? A Mont Blanc? No, it was a cross, a silver cross. He said our job was to find order in the ruin. Looking at the severed hose, I realized that the ruin of the Ethelred Institute was order. I followed George Orwell's line: power is the infliction of pain and humiliation. The Ethelred Institute didn't sell wellness. They sold control. They didn't build a spa in the desert. They built an amplifier, and I was stuck at the epicenter. I decided to leave at dawn. I threw my things in the car, my heart pounding. I turned the key in the ignition. Nothing, just a hollow metallic click. I opened the hood. The battery was ripped out. The cables were cut. My satellite phone, which I had left charging in the trailer, was gone. I was a prisoner. That night, the psychological warfare became a siege. He came in from the desert at dusk, a man, a bald gaucho wearing the faded uniform of the Institute. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He simply stopped about 20 yards from my trailer and stood there staring at my window, a motionless sentinel. And then the sound began, not in my head, but from hidden speakers around the campus. The inaudible frequency, now amplified, a physical pulse that vibrated in the floor, in the trailer walls, in my teeth. A silent ache, designed to break the mind. The man outside didn't move. He was used to it. He was home. The night was torture. The silent hum was like a drill into my soul. Fear gave way to a cold, desperate rage. I wasn't going to die here, dismantled piece by a phantom frequency and its guardian. Before dawn, I made my decision. If logic wouldn't apply, brute force would have to do. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the trailer wall. Without thinking twice, I shattered the window and threw myself out. The man, surprised by the sudden attack, started running towards me, but I didn't run from him. I ran towards the main building, to the server room, to the source of the sound. I was ambushed at the entrance. The gaucho man and another figure, equally skeletal, stepped out of the shadows. The fight was ugly, primitive. There was no technique, just panic and violence. I kicked, punched, used the fire extinguisher as a battering ram. Metal hit something soft. I heard a grunt of pain, and I broke free, running through the dark hallways, the pulsing sound growing louder with every step. I broke down the server room door. The humming noise was a physical force, an invisible wall pushing me back. With the last of my strength, I lifted the fire extinguisher and hurled it at the server rack. There was a flash of sparks, a deafening crack, and then silence. Pure, blissful, absolute silence. The humming noise was gone. In the silence, I explored the rest of the building. The men who had attacked me were gone. I found their quarters, a small room with 2 mattresses, canned food, and notes. They were the guardians, former members who had stayed behind to keep the tune. On a table, I found a final letter from the Institute's founder. He wasn't talking about profits or well-being. He was talking about listening to what the earth was saying in that place, and how the campus was not a retreat, but a diaphragm to amplify a voice that had always been there. I went out into the desert. I walked for hours aimlessly. I was found by a border patrol, dehydrated and babbling nonsense. In the official report, I closed the books of the Ethelred Institute. Cause of bankruptcy, mismanagement. Assets liquidated. But the final reflection remains, like a residual frequency. I was sent to silence a company, but I left wondering if they had tuned me into something terrible. What happens when evil is not an ideology, but a vibration in the air? You can break the amplifier, but how do you remove the resonance it has left in your bones? How do you ensure that in the silence of the night, it is not you who is unconsciously trying to hear the song of the earth again? I've always felt that a musician has a different relationship with silence. For most people, silence is the absence of sound. For me, a cellist, silence is the blank canvas on which music will be born. It's a sacred space. After my wife and I separated, I moved into an old brick building in Chicago looking for just that, a space to fill with my own music, not the memories of a life together. The apartment was on the third floor and had what realtors call character, a euphemism for old and with unpredictable acoustics. For the first few days, it was perfect. The sound of my cello filled the space, the notes of Bach echoing off the hardwood floors. The first time I noticed it, it was subtle. I was practicing a particularly difficult passage from Suite Number 1. I missed a note, stopped, took a deep breath, and in the silence that followed, I heard a muffled sound coming from the floor. It was the same passage with the same mistake, played faintly like a distant echo. I thought it was my imagination, the building settling, or perhaps a strange echo the old structure was producing. But it happened again. The next day, I was playing Vivaldi. As I finished a movement, the ghost version started up downstairs, a few seconds behind. It was a carbon copy, note for note. My first reaction was irritation. Was it another musician trying to practice along with me? It was a bizarre coincidence, but still within the realm of possibility. The problem was that the echo wasn't limited to music. One night, I got up to get a drink of water and tripped over a book, which fell to the floor with a dull thud. 3 seconds later, the same thud came from below. My heart raced. I tested it. I clapped my hands 3 times. Clap, 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 dot, silence. And then, pum, pum, pum. The muffled sound, the same cadence coming from the ground. This wasn't an echo. It was an imitation. There was someone in the apartment below listening to every sound I made and playing it back. The sense of violation was immediate and absolute. My sanctuary of silence had become a resonance chamber, and I was the tuning fork. The days that followed were an exercise in paranoia. My every step, my every cough, my every object I moved was followed by its phantom replica. I began to walk on tiptoe, holding my breath. The silence I had been seeking so much was now my only weapon. If I didn't make a sound, my mysterious neighbor wouldn't either. We lived in a shared, tense silence for almost a week. I've always been struck by a quote from that Danish philosopher. What's his name? Oh yes, Søren Kierkegaard. I follow his line of thinking that the worst form of despair is not choosing to be yourself. I was being robbed of myself, of my own sounding existence. My actions were no longer my own. They became a script for the ghost downstairs. The final straw was when I decided to confront him. I needed to know who or what was doing this. I came up with a plan. I picked up my cello, and instead of playing a familiar piece, I improvised. I created a short, dissonant, unique melody, a sonic signature that only I could produce at that moment. I played it once and waited, my heart in my mouth. The silence stretched on for 10 seconds, 20, a minute. I felt an immense relief. Maybe it was over, maybe I was crazy after all. And then I heard it, coming from the floor, my improvised melody note by note, with the same hesitation, the same strength in my fingers. It was the breaking of logic. It was impossible. It was no longer about someone listening to me. It was like someone was living my life with a delay of a few seconds. In a fit of rage and fear, I marched to the door of the apartment below 2B and pounded on the wood. "I know you're in there. Stop it. Who are you?" I yelled at the silent door. No answer. I pressed my ear against the cold wood, listening for any sound. And it came, the muffled sound of fists pounding on wood in time with my own, and then a faint voice, distorted by the door, repeating my own words. I know you're there. Stop it. Who are you? I recoiled as if shocked. This apartment wasn't imitating me. It was absorbing me. I ran away that night. I abandoned the apartment and most of my things. For months, I lived in hotels, always asking for the top floor room. Today, I have a new place, a small single-story house. No neighbors upstairs or downstairs, but the experience has left a scar. A week ago, I received a letter from my former building manager. It was an official notice from the condominium, dated my last week there. It was a noise complaint filed against me by the resident of apartment 4B, the floor above. The complaint said that I was making repetitive, imitative noises as if mocking the sounds of the building day and night. Do we go crazy alone, or do we need an echo to confirm our own existence? And what is scarier? A neighbor who imitates you, or discovering that in the silence, you have become an echo of yourself? I don't know the answer. I only know that sometimes when a house is too quiet, I swear I hear the sound of someone breathing exactly in time with me. And I pray that it is me